June 15th, 1868, brought with it the kind of heat that made the prairie grass shimmer like water. And it was on this day that Catherine Marie Whitmore first saw the man who would alter the course of her existence. She stood beside her father's wagon at Fort Laramie in the Wyoming Territory, her calico dress dusty from weeks on the Oregon Trail, watching as a tall figure emerged from the fort's main gate. He wore buckskin and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to this vast, untamed land. His name was James Running Deer Sullivan, son of an Irish fur trader and a Lakota mother. And he served as a scout and interpreter for the United States Army. At 26, he had already lived more lives than most men twice his age. Catherine was 19, educated at a boarding school in Boston, and entirely unprepared for the wilderness her family now traveled through. Their eyes met across the dusty parade ground, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that defied the boundaries of their separate worlds. Fort Laramie in 1868 was a place of contradictions, according to historical records from the National Archives. The fort served as a crucial waypoint on the western migration routes, while simultaneously being a powder keg of tension between the expanding United States and the Plains tribes. The Treaty of Fort Laramie had been signed just 2 months earlier, in April, promising to close the Bozeman Trail and establish the Great Sioux Reservation. But promises made on paper rarely held firm on the frontier. Catherine's father, William Whitmore, was a Presbyterian minister who had sold his comfortable Philadelphia church to bring the gospel to Oregon. He possessed the rigid moral certainty of his calling but lacked any practical understanding of the land he now crossed. Catherine's mother had died of cholera 3 weeks into their journey, and since then, Catherine had taken on the responsibilities of cooking, mending, and caring for her 2 younger brothers, Thomas and Samuel. James first spoke to Catherine 3 days after her arrival, when her father hired him to guide their wagon train through the remaining stretch to South Pass. His voice was low and careful, his English flawless, despite the slight rhythm of another language beneath it. He explained the route, the water sources, the places where hostile bands might be encountered. Catherine listened with an intensity that had nothing to do with geography. "You should not have come," he told her privately, after the meeting with her father. "This land takes more than it gives." "Perhaps," she replied, meeting his dark eyes without flinching, "but I am here nonetheless." He studied her for a long moment, seeing something in this slight, dusty woman that intrigued him. She did not look away, did not lower her gaze, as women of her station were taught to do. In that moment, neither could have known that their meeting would become a testament to love's ability to bridge worlds that history seemed determined to tear apart. July 1st, 1868 marked the day the wagon train departed Fort Laramie. Catherine found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet scout who rode at the column's edge. James kept his distance during the daylight hours, maintaining the professional detachment expected of him. But in the evenings when the wagon circled and fires were lit, he would sometimes sit near the Whitmore camp, teaching Thomas and Samuel how to read animal tracks in the dirt. William Whitmore watched these interactions with growing unease. He was not a cruel man, but he carried the prejudices of his time and upbringing. To him, James represented something dangerous, a blurring of the lines that God and society had drawn. Yet he could not deny the man's skill or the safety his presence provided. The trail they followed was treacherous, winding through territories where the recent treaty had done little to ease tensions. Catherine learned to recognize the signs James pointed out, the distant dust cloud that meant buffalo or possibly riders, a particular call of a bird that was not actually a bird, the smell of smoke on the wind that indicated either a camp or trouble. He taught her without seeming to teach, speaking in observations rather than instructions, respecting her intelligence in a way few men ever had. "Your people believe they own this land because they write it on paper," James said one evening, as they stood watch together on the edge of camp. "My mother's people believe the land owns us, that we are part of it, like the grass and the stones." "What do you believe?" Catherine asked. He was quiet for a long time, his eyes scanning the darkening horizon. "I believe that when 2 worlds meet, something must break. I've watched it happen my entire life. I am the break, Miss Whitmore. I am what happens when things that should not touch come together." Catherine felt her heart constrict at the loneliness in his voice. "Perhaps you are not what breaks, but what bridges." He turned to look at her then, and she saw surprise in his expression, followed by something deeper, something that made her breath catch. But he said nothing more, simply nodded once, and moved away to check the picket line where the horses were tethered. The wagon train moved slowly, covering perhaps 15 miles on a good day. They passed Independence Rock, where hundreds of emigrants had carved their names, adding their own marks to the stone. They forded rivers swollen with snowmelt, losing to wagons, and nearly losing Samuel when he slipped on the rocks. It was James who dove into the rushing water and pulled the boy to safety, holding him against his chest as Catherine and her father pulled them both to shore. William Whitmore thanked James stiffly, the words clearly difficult for him. James simply nodded and walked away, but Catherine followed him. She found him wringing out his shirt by the supply wagon, his back marked with scars she did not ask about. "Thank you," she said. "For my brother, it is what I am paid to do." "No," she said firmly. "You were paid to guide us. You saved him because you were good." He turned to face her, water dripping from his hair. "Do not make me better than I am, Catherine." It was the first time he had used her Christian name, and the sound of it in his voice changed something between them. They stood there in the fading light, the camp busy behind them, and acknowledged without words what was growing in the space they shared. August 7th, 1868, found the wagon train ascending through South Pass, the gentlest crossing of the Continental Divide, where waters began to flow west instead of east. The landscape had transformed from prairie to high desert, with sagebrush replacing grass and the mountains rising like ancient sentinels on either side. Catherine walked beside the wagon, her boots worn through at the soles, her face burned brown by the relentless sun. She had become someone her Boston schoolmates would not recognize. James rode ahead to scout the trail, but he returned each evening, and Catherine had come to live for those moments when she could see his silhouette against the sunset. He spoke of everything and nothing, his childhood moving between his father's trading post and his mother's village, her years learning Latin and embroidery when she longed to learn about the stars. He taught her words in Lakota, and she taught him poetry by Wordsworth and Keats. "My mother's people are wintering in the Powder River country," James told her one night as they stood watch together. "The treaty says they can remain there, but I know the whites will not honor it. They never do. There is gold in the Black Hills, and when men want gold, treaties become worthless." Catherine understood he was speaking of more than politics. He was telling her about the impossibility of their situation, the chasm that lay between his world and hers. But she had crossed half a continent, had buried her mother on the prairie, had learned that certainty was an illusion and that all any person could do was choose love or fear. "When we reach Oregon," she said carefully, "my father plans to establish his mission near the Willamette Valley. He will need someone who speaks the native languages, someone who understands both peoples." James looked at her sharply. He would never accept such an arrangement. He might, if I insisted upon it. "Catherine," he spoke her name like a warning and a prayer, "you do not understand what you would be giving up. Your people would shun you. You would be neither white nor Indian, belonging nowhere. I would belong with you," she said simply. "Is that not somewhere?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of insects and the distant howl of a coyote. Finally, James reached out and took her hand, the first time he had touched her beyond necessary assistance. His palm was calloused and warm, and Catherine felt the touch travel through her entire body. "If I make you a promise," he said slowly, "it will be under this sky, in the way of my mother's people. There will be no church, no blessing from your father. Can you accept that?" As Catherine whispered, "Yes." And so, on that August night at South Pass, James Running Deer Sullivan and Catherine Marie Whitmore pledged themselves to each other. He spoke words in Lakota that she did not fully understand, but felt in her bones. She spoke her vows in English, promising to walk beside him regardless of the cost. They had no witnesses, but the stars and the vast indifference of the land itself. When they returned to camp, Catherine's dress bore grass stains, and her hair had come loose from its pins. William Whitmore looked at his daughter with dawning horror, understanding in an instant what had occurred. The confrontation came swiftly and terribly. "You will not destroy yourself for this savage," he said, his face pale with rage. "He is more civilized than any man I have known," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I have made my choice." August 23rd, 1868, brought a reckoning that Catherine had known was inevitable. The wagon train had descended from South Pass into the Green River Valley, and tensions within the group had been building like storm clouds on the horizon. Other families had noticed the time Catherine spent with James, and whispers had begun to circulate. Whispers that reached her father's ears and hardened his heart to stone. William Whitmore called a council of the wagon train's leaders, demanding that James Sullivan be dismissed from his position as guide. He stood before the assembled men, his Bible clutched in his hands like a weapon, and spoke of moral corruption, of God's natural order, of the sanctity of racial purity. Catherine stood outside the circle, forbidden to speak, but refusing to leave. Her eyes locked on James as he listened to her father's denunciations with an expression of terrible resignation. "This man has defiled my daughter with his attentions," William declared, his voice carrying across the camp. "He has used his position of trust to seduce a Christian woman, and I will not allow him to continue leading us westward." James finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "I have done nothing without Miss Whitmore's consent and knowledge. If you believe her unable to make her own choices, Reverend, then you insult her intelligence, not my honor." "Her intelligence?" William's laugh was bitter. "She is a girl confused and far from home. You have taken advantage of her vulnerability." Catherine could remain silent no longer. She pushed through the circle of men, ignoring their shocked expressions, and stood beside James. "I am 19 years old, Father. I have buried my mother, crossed 1,000 miles of wilderness, and learned that the civilized world you venerate is built on cruelty and lies. James has shown me nothing but respect and truth. If you cannot accept that, then you do not know your own daughter." The council descended into chaos. Some men supported William's position, citing concerns about propriety and the example being set for their own daughters. Others, particularly those whose families James had saved from various disasters on the trail, spoke in his defense. The argument continued late into the night, finally ending with a compromise that satisfied no one. James would continue as guide until they reached Fort Bridger, where he would be paid and dismissed. That night, Catherine and James met away from the camp in a grove of cottonwoods near the river. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the water. They both knew they were approaching a crossroads, a point where decisions could no longer be deferred. "You should continue to Oregon with your family," James said, though his voice lacked conviction. "In time, you will forget this, forget me. You will marry a proper man and have a proper life." "Do you truly believe I could forget you?" Catherine asked. "Do you think love is something that can be put aside like an old dress?" "Love is not always enough," James replied. "My father loved my mother, and it brought her nothing but hardship. She was cast out by her people for marrying a white man, and the whites never accepted her as an equal. She died young, worn down by living between worlds." "Then we will make our own world," Catherine said fiercely. "We will go somewhere neither of our peoples can find us. The territories are vast. Surely there is space for two people who want only to live in peace." James looked at her. This woman who had traveled so far and transformed so completely from the prim Boston girl who had arrived at Fort Laramie. He saw her strength, her determination, and also her naivety about the forces arrayed against them. But he also saw hope, and he had been without hope for so long that it hurt to feel it now. Historical accounts from the Wyoming State Archives document numerous instances of interracial relationships during this period of Western expansion. Though few were openly acknowledged or accepted. The children of such unions, like James himself, often found themselves navigating between cultures, fully accepted by neither. The social and legal barriers against miscegenation were reinforced by both custom and, in many territories, actual law. "If we do this," James said slowly, "we must understand that there is no going back. Your family will disown you. My mother's people may reject me for bringing a white woman among them. We will be alone. We will have each other," Catherine said. "Is that not enough?" He pulled her close then, holding her as if she might disappear. "Yes," he whispered against her hair. "Yes, it is enough." They made their plans in whispers, knowing they had little time before reaching Fort Bridger, where their forced separation would begin. September 5th, 1868 was the night Catherine Marie Whitmore left her father's wagon forever, carrying only what she could fit in a small leather satchel. The wagon train was camped along the Bear River, 3 days from Fort Bridger, and the night watch had been purposely arranged by sympathetic members of the company who disapproved of William Whitmore's harsh judgment. Catherine moved through the darkness like a ghost, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire camp. James waited with 2 horses beyond the picket line. Provisions already packed in saddlebags he had been quietly accumulating for weeks. He had left his final payment from the wagon company on the tongue of the Whitmore wagon, along with a letter addressed to William Whitmore. The letter was brief and formal, explaining that Catherine had made her choice freely and would not be returning. He did not apologize, because he believed he had nothing to apologize for. But he did express hope that someday the Reverend might find peace with his daughter's decision. Catherine paused before mounting, looking back at the circle of wagons where her brothers slept, where her father would wake to find her gone. Tears ran down her face, but she did not hesitate. Thomas was 15 now, Samuel 13, old enough to understand that love sometimes required impossible choices. She had written them each a letter hidden beneath their bedrolls, telling them she loved them and asking them to remember her kindly. "You certain?" James asked one final time, giving her the chance to turn back. "I have never been more certain of anything," Catherine replied, and swung herself into the saddle with the competence she had gained over months on the trail. They rode north, away from the emigrant road, into country that few white settlers had yet penetrated. James knew this land from his years as a scout and trader, knew where water could be found and where they might travel without encountering either military patrols or hostile bands. They rode through the night and into the next day, stopping only to rest the horses, pushing hard to put distance between themselves and any pursuit that might come. William Whitmore discovered his daughter's absence at dawn. His roar of rage and grief woke the entire camp, and he immediately demanded that men be sent to retrieve her. But the wagon train captain, a pragmatic man named Joseph Crawford, refused. They were too close to Fort Bridger to delay, and he would not risk men's lives chasing after a woman who had clearly left of her own will. The argument that followed split the camp, with some supporting William's position and others arguing that Catherine was of age and entitled to her own choices. In the end, William Whitmore departed the wagon train with his 2 sons, hiring 3 men at Fort Bridger to help him search for Catherine. They followed the trail north for 5 days before losing it in rocky country, where even an experienced tracker could find no sign. William returned to the fort defeated, his face aged a decade, his faith in God's justice severely tested. He would continue to Oregon, would establish his mission, but the light had gone out of his eyes. Meanwhile, Catherine and James traveled through the Absaroka Mountains, moving through landscapes so beautiful it made Catherine weep. They saw elk by the hundreds, their antlers like forests against the sky. They watched golden eagles hunt marmots on rocky slopes. They forded crystal streams where cutthroat trout flashed like jewels. James taught Catherine to set snares, to find edible plants, to read the weather in the clouds. She taught herself to set aside the lessons of civilization and learn the older rules of survival. On the 10th day of their flight, they reached a hidden valley James had discovered years before while hunting with his mother's people. A stream ran through it, bordered by willows and cottonwoods, and the surrounding mountains provided shelter from the worst weather. Meadows offered grazing for the horses, and game signs were everywhere. It was not Eden, but it was theirs. "We will winter here," James said. "I will build us a cabin before the snows come." Catherine looked at the valley, at this place that would become her home, and felt something settle in her chest. She had crossed the continental divide in more ways than one, had left behind the world of parlors and propriety for this wild freedom. She was not the girl who had left Philadelphia, and she would never be that girl again. October 20th, 1868, found Catherine and James Sullivan. For she had taken his name in her heart, if not in any legal record, standing before the frame of their half-built cabin as the first snow of the season began to fall. The structure was simple but solid, using techniques James had learned from both his father's Irish heritage and his mother's people. Logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace built into one wall, a door that faced east to catch the morning sun. Catherine had transformed in the 6 weeks since they had arrived in the valley. Her hands, once soft and suited only for needlework, had developed calluses from helping to notch logs and gather stones. Her hair, no longer carefully pinned, hung in a thick braid down her back. She wore a dress of buckskin that James had traded for at a Shoshone camp they had carefully approached. And she moved with the sure-footedness of someone learning to read the land beneath her feet. They worked from dawn until dark, driven by the knowledge that winter in the mountains was unforgiving. James hunted deer and elk, smoking the meat for storage. Catherine gathered roots and berries, learning which plants were edible and which would kill. Together they cut and stacked firewood until their arms ached. At night, they collapsed into their bedrolls near the fire, too exhausted for anything but sleep. But there were moments of joy too, moments that made all the hardship worthwhile. The morning Catherine successfully snared her first rabbit, and James's face broke into genuine laughter at her triumphant whoop. The evening they watched a herd of bighorn sheep pick their way across the cliffs above their valley, moving with impossible grace across vertical stone. The night they finished the cabin's roof and lay inside, listening to rain drum against the bark shingles, dry and safe and together. "Tell me about your mother," Catherine said one night as they sat before the fire, the cabin finally complete and winter settling in around them. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and they were confined to their small space, but Catherine found she did not mind. She had James to herself, no watching eyes, no disapproving voices. James was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. "Her name was W.I. Hopai Wing," he finally said. "Morning Star Woman. She was the daughter of a Lakota medicine man, educated in the old ways. When she met my father, she was already promised to a warrior of her band. Choosing him brought shame to her family, but she chose love," Catherine said softly. "She chose love, and it cost her everything," James replied. Her people turned away from her. She lived in the gap between worlds, and it wore her down. She died when I was 12, of pneumonia, the winter after my father was killed in a dispute over furs. I was alone then, neither white nor Lakota, trusted by neither side. Catherine reached out and took his hand. "You are not alone now." He looked at her, this woman who had given up everything to be with him, and felt his heart constrict with a mixture of love and fear. "Sometimes I wake in the night," he confessed, "and I am terrified that you will regret this. That you will wake one day and realize what you have sacrificed." "I have sacrificed nothing that mattered," Catherine said firmly. "My father's approval? It was conditional on my obedience, not given freely. Boston society? They cared more about my appearance than my thoughts. I have traded a gilded cage for this wild freedom, and I would make the same choice 1,000 times." The winter tested them in ways neither had anticipated. Snow piled deep, sometimes trapping them in the cabin for days. Food ran low, and they learned to stretch their supplies, to make soups from bones and gravy from grease. Catherine developed a cough that lingered for weeks, and James sat beside her through feverish nights, brewing teas from plants he had gathered and praying to gods of both his parents' peoples. But they survived, and more than survived, they thrived. Catherine learned to sew with sinew, to tan hides, to make soap from ash and fat. James carved furniture from logs, teaching Catherine the skills his father had taught him. They created a life from nothing but determination and love. And when spring finally broke and the snow began to melt, they emerged from their cabin, thinner but undefeated. April came, and with it the first wildflowers pushing through the melting snow. Catherine discovered she was pregnant on a morning when the world seemed impossibly new and green. She had suspected for weeks but had not wanted to speak it aloud, afraid that words might somehow break the magic. Now, standing in the meadow with her hand on her still flat stomach, she knew with certainty that she carried a child, a bridge between two worlds, a testament to everything she and James had chosen. June 12, 1869 brought unexpected visitors to the Hidden Valley, and with them a reminder that isolation was never complete. That the wider world always found ways to intrude. Catherine was hanging laundry on a line James had strung between two trees. When she heard the distant sound of horses, her hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly, now prominent at 6 months, and she called out for James. He emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand, his face set in the wary expression she had come to recognize. They watched as 3 riders picked their way down the slope into the valley, moving slowly enough to signal peaceful intentions. As they drew closer, James relaxed slightly, recognizing one of the men as 2 horses, a Shoshone elder he had traded with the previous fall. The 3 men dismounted and greeted James in Shoshone, then in English when they saw Catherine. 2 horses spoke with the formality of important news being delivered. A patrol of United States cavalry had been asking questions at various trading posts and native camps. seeking information about a white woman traveling with a half-breed scout. A man fitting William Whitmore's description had been offering money for information. "Your father has not given up," James said to Catherine after the men had departed. Having accepted their hospitality and traded news for supplies, he is still searching. Catherine felt her world tilt slightly. She had believed, perhaps naively, that distance and time would cause her father to accept her choice. Instead, he had spent a year searching, had somehow obtained enough funds to hire men and continue the hunt. The obsession spoke of love twisted into something darker, something that could not accept defeat. "We should move deeper into the mountains," James said. "Find somewhere even more remote." "No," Catherine said firmly, one hand on her belly. "I will not run anymore. I will not raise our child in constant flight. My father comes, we will face him together." James looked at his wife, for that is what she was to him regardless of any legal document, and saw the same fierce determination that had first drawn him to her. She had changed so much from the Boston girl in calico, had become someone who belonged to this wild country, but her core remained unchanged. She was stubborn and brave and sometimes foolishly idealistic, and he loved her completely. They made preparations anyway, practical plans that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with prudence. James cached supplies at 3 different locations in the mountains, places they could reach quickly if they needed to abandon the cabin. He taught Catherine routes through the high country, paths that horses could follow even in winter. They discussed where they might go if forced to leave, considering options from the Canadian territories to the deserts of the Southwest. Summer passed with agonizing slowness. Catherine's pregnancy progressed, and James became increasingly protective, insisting she rest more and work less. She tolerated his concern with good humor, knowing it came from love and from his own fears about childbirth. Having lost his mother and knowing how many women died, bringing life into the world, on a hot August afternoon, almost exactly a year after their pledge at South Pass, Catherine went into labor. James had arranged for a Shoshone woman named Pine Leaf Woman to attend the birth, and she arrived with herbs and knowledge passed down through generations. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day, and James paced outside the cabin like a caged wolf, praying to every deity he had ever heard of. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, James burst through the door to find Catherine, pale but smiling, holding a tiny girl wrapped in soft buckskin. The baby had her mother's fair hair and her father's dark eyes, and she wailed with the robust lungs of the healthy. They named her Sarah Morningstar Sullivan, honoring both their heritages, claiming for her a future they hoped would be kinder than their past. But William Whitmore was drawing closer. Following a trail of whispers and sightings, driven by a determination that had become indistinguishable from madness, he had lost weight, lost money, lost everything in his pursuit of the daughter he believed had been stolen from him. He no longer spoke of rescuing Catherine, but of punishing James Sullivan for the crime of theft. The Bible he carried was annotated with passages about vengeance and righteousness, and the men he had hired were no longer respectable guides, but harder men who asked fewer questions. September 30th. 1869 was the day William Whitmore finally found the valley where his daughter had made her home. And it was the day that tested every choice Catherine had made since that June evening at Fort Laramie. She was nursing Sarah in the cabin when James burst through the door, his face urgent but controlled. "Riders coming," he said shortly. "For men. Your father is among them." Catherine felt her blood turn cold, but her hands remained steady as she placed Sarah in the cradle board James had made. Securing it to her back in the manner Pine Leaf Woman had taught her, she would not be separated from her daughter, not for any reason. Together, she and James stepped outside to meet the approaching men. William Whitmore had aged terribly in the years since Catherine had seen him. His hair had gone completely gray, his face was gaunt, and his eyes held a fevered intensity that frightened her. The 3 men with him looked like trouble, the kind of men who lived on the frontier's edge where law was scarce and violence common. They spread out slightly as they dismounted, a formation that spoke of anticipated conflict. "Catherine," William said, and his voice broke on her name. "My daughter, I have come to take you home." "I am home," Catherine replied, her voice clear and strong. "This is my home, father. It's my husband, and this is your granddaughter." William's eyes moved to the cradle board, seeing the baby for the first time, and something shattered in his expression. He had known intellectually that time had passed, that consequences had unfolded. But confronting the physical reality of his daughter's choices was different. The baby represented everything he had tried to prevent. The mixing of bloodlines he considered an abomination. The destruction of the pure Christian future he had envisioned for Catherine. "That creature is not my grandchild," he said, his voice tight with disgust. "You have been defiled, Catherine, but you can still be saved. Leave this savage and return with me. We will find a place where no one knows what has happened, where you can start again." "I do not need to start again," Catherine said. "I need you to accept that I have made my choice, and it was the right choice for me. James is a good man, Father. He has cared for me better than any civilized gentleman ever did. Our daughter is beautiful and innocent, and your refusal to see that is your tragedy, not mine." One of William's hired men, a scarred individual who reeked of whiskey, spat tobacco juice and spoke up. "We being paid to bring back a white woman," he said. "Nobody said nothing about her wanting to stay with the breed. Maybe we should just take her and let the preacher sort out the rest later." James moved, putting himself between the man and Catherine, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. "You will not touch her," he said quietly, "any of you." The tension in the clearing was palpable, violence hanging in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Catherine could feel Sarah stirring against her back, could sense the baby picking up on the fear and anger radiating from the adults. She stepped forward, moving beside James rather than behind him, showing her father and his men that she stood as James's equal. "I am not a possession to be reclaimed," Catherine said, her voice cutting through the silence. "I am a woman who has made her choices freely. I left of my own will, Father. I married James of my own will. I carry our child of my own will. Your search ends here, because I am not lost. I am exactly where I choose to be." William Whitmore stood trembling, his entire worldview crumbling before him. He had traveled so far, spent so much, convinced himself that Catherine was an innocent victim who needed rescue. Confronting the reality that she was not only willing, but happy, that she defended her husband and child with fierce conviction, was more than his rigid mind could process. "You are damned," he finally whispered. "You have chosen damnation." "If your heaven has no place for my family," Catherine replied, "then I choose whatever comes after. I would rather be damned with those I love than saved in the company of those who hate." The words hung in the air, final and irrevocable. William Whitmore swayed slightly, and for a moment Catherine thought he might collapse. Then he turned away, climbing back onto his horse with the stiff movements of a man who has been broken. The three hired men looked uncertain, but when William began riding away without a word, they followed. Catherine and James stood watching until the riders disappeared over the ridge, neither speaking, both understanding that something profound had just occurred. William Whitmore would not return. His crusade had ended not in violence but in a surrender more complete than any Catherine could have imagined. She had stood before her father and declared her independence, and he had finally understood that she was beyond his reach. That night, with Sarah sleeping peacefully in her cradle board and James holding Catherine close, she allowed herself to weep. Not from regret, but from the grief of necessary endings, from the sorrow of knowing that her father would live the rest of his life unable to accept the happiness she had found. She mourned the relationship they could never have. Grandfather Sarah would never know, the forgiveness that would never come. March 25th, 1870, one brought the first warm winds of spring to the valley, and with them a sense that perhaps the worst storms of their lives had passed. Catherine stood outside the cabin watching Sarah, now a sturdy toddler of 18 months, toddle after butterflies in the new grass. The child spoke in a mixture of English and Lakota, learning words from both her parents' worlds, growing up in a space that was uniquely her own. James had returned from a trading trip to a Shoshone camp with news that made Catherine's heart lift with cautious hope. William Whitmore had indeed given up his search, but more than that, he had reportedly experienced what his congregation called a spiritual crisis. He had abandoned his Oregon mission and returned east, telling his sons before he departed that he had failed Catherine but prayed she might someday forgive him. It was not the reconciliation Catherine had once dreamed of, but it was a form of peace. The valley had become more than a hiding place. It had become a genuine home. Over the past 2 years, James and Catherine had built a life of surprising richness. They had expanded the cabin, adding a second room for Sarah and a covered porch where they could sit on summer evenings. James had built a small barn for the horses and a root cellar for storing their winter provisions. Catherine had planted a garden using seeds she had carried all the way from Philadelphia, and the sight of familiar vegetables growing in this wild place gave her a satisfaction she had never known in civilization. They were not entirely isolated. A few times each season, James would make trading trips to various camps and small settlements, exchanging furs and preserved meat for supplies they could not produce themselves: flour, sugar, ammunition, cloth. Sometimes he brought back news of the wider world, stories that seemed to come from a different planet. President Ulysses Grant in Washington, railroads pushing ever westward, conflicts with Plains tribes as the government broke treaty after treaty. The world beyond the valley was changing rapidly, but their small corner remained largely untouched. Catherine had taken up writing again, something she had abandoned during the desperate months of their flight and the hardship of that first winter.